Hello.
Thanks very much. So, Chris, PGA Tour coach, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So I coach a handful of guys on the PGA Tour. I've been doing stuff out there for a little over, I don't know, a while. Time flies. It's been quite a while. But I've taught in a variety of environments, which I'm actually quite proud of. I've taught at some academies, and then I've taught at a driving range where I just kind of built a book through word of mouth, which I think that's like a very raw form of teaching, which I'm again proud of that. That was fun time. Have taught at country clubs. A place called Gleneagles in Dallas, a place called Dallas National, and now I'm doing an academy over at TPC Las Colinas in Dallas, and I got an awesome group of coaches, which is fun to mentor, and a handful that's and sort of just a quick gloss over. That's my career, I guess you could say.
Cool. Love it. So you've been around, and I think that your background is kind of similar to mine, where you've been in the public space, having to hustle for lessons. You've been in the private space, focused on a membership. I know you've traveled around doing a lot of different things and listened to a lot of teachers. I think that if you talk to guys in the industry, not too many people say that, there's no more guys than you that have gone out and listened to the other guys that have done it. You've done your research, you've listened to those guys. I think that's awesome. What do you think has attributed, some of these things you've done? What can you attribute to your success where you are today?
Yeah, I think it is that overall spirit. I feel like I've looked at this as a path of like my own learnings, and then from there, how do I impart whatever it is to the clients I'm fortunate enough to work with. And those learning environments have been everything from the recreational golfers that I've coached, because every time you give a lesson, I think that's its own opportunity to learn. Um, I went to grad school for biomechanics and studied under a guy named Dr. Kwan. He was sort of the professor in the program. And then guys like Sasha McKenzie, who's a fellow Canadian. So I've picked the brains of people who are, I guess, somewhat outside the golf industry, adjacent to it. They're not necessarily teachers, but they're doing research. I think that's been a very rich sort of source to tap into. Um, been fortunate enough to work with some really great players. I worked with Tiger for a handful of years. I worked with Bryson DeChambeau, Jason Day, Xander Schauffele, and all these guys. You're helping them with their game, but you're learning from them at the same time. And then, like you had mentioned, a lot of other teachers. I love picking the brains of other coaches. I've been doing a show with the Golf Channel where you go out and find coaches who I think have something interesting to say and kind of learn their stuff. And there's the stuff you talk about on the camera, then behind the scenes, that's where like the really juicy conversations come. So just doing that project was like an awesome education experience. So I think I would attribute a lot of my success to looking at it. Yes, I'm teaching, but also it's been this like journey of learning that I feel like is never ending and will be never, it will be never ending. And I feel like a part of that is, um, you know, trying to go into each day with a certain kind of like, even though I've been doing this for a while, and I feel like I've, done a good job at like acquiring, a certain body of knowledge and skill set, et cetera, but really trying to stay in that ever curious mindset, you know, walking that line between really challenging yourself of like, being your own harshest critic and like, always trying to constantly stress test your own ideas. But then when you're in the moment with a player, you have to go in there with a certain level of confidence. So it's kind of like, living in that paradox in a way where you're like always like questioning yourself, but then at the same time, at that moment, someone's trying to get better at the game, you know, coming to the game with what you got and doing that with a certain level of confidence. So yeah, I would say in a nutshell, that's kind of been.
I like it. Now you talk about how you've got a thirst for knowledge and a thirst for why it is things happen. What tour pros and what players have you worked with that have something similar to that are really that really want to know the nuts and bolts to things?
Tiger was very much that way. And the nuts and bolts, it's weird, right? Because some players don't necessarily need to know like the air quotes science behind it, and they definitely don't care about the jargon. But they want to know how their stuff works, right? They really want to know how their stuff works. They have their own kind of like intuition and just trying to make sense of it all. And oftentimes what I have found that the top guys have a certain level of um, fearlessness when it comes to an element of experimentation and the effort to get better. They maybe intuitively know that in order to get better, there's an element of I got to try this out type of thing, and it can't just be this is familiar or whatever, so I'm just going to do this. You could argue that actually might be the best case if someone's at the very top of their game, like Tiger, right? Like you could argue that maybe his experimentation undermined his success at some capacity. But I would say his overall decision making process that got him to that top was that experimentation. And then once he was there, it's a little bit of a 2020 hindsight to say, oh, you should stop doing that when that's what got him there. Maybe one isolated sort of like decision or air quotes experiment wasn't good for him. But if you were to take the whole bundle of his experiments, like it obviously worked out really well. So I think just that openness of I'm going to try this or I'm going to try that as part of the path of trying to make big jumps in skill level seems to be a pretty strong commonality amongst a lot of these guys who have had that really strong trajectory of always improving.
I can see that. And you mentioned something really neat there. You said the guys want to know what makes their stuff work. Like, why does their swing work? Where I think from working with the average golfer, my members, they want to know why their swing is going bad. What am I doing wrong? Do you find that you work with better players trying to explain to them why their stuff works rather than trying to potentially fix the problem? It's a different channel of talk or discussion there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the more you can frame things in that positive side, it's like, okay, when you hit this shot, what are you doing well? That tends to be, a better pathway for just like doing more of that. I wouldn't. I mean, there are times when people are trying to troubleshoot certain things where it's like, man, I hit this shot. I need to know what happens on that, and it's hard to just like talk that away because they're still thinking about it, even if you try to like. So I do find the reality of it is sometimes like getting into a little bit of an understanding of when they get the result they don't want, what's happening. But at the end of the day, like that in isolation isn't necessarily actionable, right? It's one thing to understand that, but then you got to understand what it is when you do the stuff you do want, or how do you do the stuff that you do want. So I think you can sit in that for a second, but you can't like wallow in it because that's just not productive.
Makes sense. That makes sense. So, with these better players you've worked with, do you find that there's anyone that comes out that really doesn't want to, let's say, make any changes, maybe hesitant to make any changes, versus a player potentially, if I could say Tiger might come to you with required to make changes. Jason Day came to you, I think, required to make some changes to make himself a little healthier. Do you ever have the reverse where someone comes to you and says, I want to get better, but I want to make the smallest, least amount of change possible?
Yeah, I mean, I have. I think that's there's going to be a certain population of professional golfers and golfers just in general where they're like, look, my game is really good. I'm not necessarily. I want to get better, but I want to get better in a really non-invasive way. I'm sorry. Is this messing this up? I'm getting a call right now.
You're good.
Is it messing it up at all or no?
No, you're good.
Um, and in a very non-invasive way. And I think that's where it becomes more of a strategy of how do you practice, how do you sort of identify what your personal sweet spot is, and then have strategies to keep you in that more often. And that's that to me is part of the overall, if you will, interviewing process I do with the players to see where they're at with their game. What is their perception of how they're going to be better? So in that instance, they're going to get better by, squeezing the most out of what they currently do and just finding those small edges in how they practice course management, things that are just not swing related, which is super, super important. And I think that aspect of it is something that every professional, every golfer should try to squeeze the most out of. And then sometimes you have situations where a person's like, whatever it is, I have back issues, or, no matter what I've done, my driver has too big of misses. And you do your evaluation and it's like, okay, maybe you need to roll the dice and take a strategy that's a little bit more invasive and starting to get into, some swing changes. But even that you want to do, very thoughtfully, especially if it's a tour player, because, anytime you make a swing change, there's oftentimes some risk of it not, working out or not working out in the time duration that you hope. And if that happens, you could lose your job.
Yeah.
But, as someone, if they're a recreational golfer, it's like, look, the reality of it is the difference between shooting, whatever, 85 and 90 isn't going to be that dramatic on your life.
No,
But then,
true.
so, if you're not playing professionally, the risk goes way less, right? And it's actually funny because I'll get, sometimes, some say juniors or early college players, where there'd be like, I want to play professional golf. And it's like, what's your scoring average? And they're like, oh, my scoring average is 74. And it's like, okay, in that situation, if it's 74 and it's been that way for a long time and they're hitting a bit of a plateau, it may be a situation where it's like, hey, you might need to roll the dice on some stuff because, the difference between your scoring average of being 72 and 85 is really not that different. Either way, you're going to go have to get a job when you graduate college. So you might as well go roll the dice a little bit. So I think this is all part of like the evaluation of the person, their goals, their time allocation that they can, put to the game and practice and all that. And then from there, you put together a game plan that fits, all those things.
I love it. I think that's great. And that jumps right into my last thing, like the mindset or the attitude behind someone who wants to get better. We've all met golfers that just want to play golf. They show up, they want to play golf. It's great. Have a burger, take off. Great. But there's a mindset. There's some golfers that actually want to get better. They use the handicap system kind of for what it's there for. Hey, I'm a 12. I'm using this as a measurement to try to get to a 9. Talk to me about how you see that person.
Yeah, I mean, if that is their goal. I mean, and that's been one of my favorite sort of ranges to work with, where a person's like, again, like you said, I'm a 12 and I want to get to a 9 or 5 or whatever, and that's a fun project because it changes the game for that person, and they do get to that goal. It's just so much fun, but they've got to be willing. That becomes some big differences that oftentimes involve, having all the stuff in their game cleaned up, like we're saying, like the way they practice, but it oftentimes involves some pretty big swing changes. And that's where I think the person, they gotta do it. They gotta be willing to really let go of what is familiar, in terms of their motion, and go down that path of what feels unfamiliar. And I think they got to oftentimes, because, I've seen people do that, multiple times. And when that's worked out, they got to be pretty consistent with like the time they allocate towards it. And it almost becomes like its own, I mean, I don't know if this is exactly right, but just from the outside looking at it, it almost becomes like its own martial art where they become like really into their body. They really kind of feel the motion. They're really changing things, almost like the katas, where they're like moving, very deliberately. And then they take it out to the course and they test, they try to test it out and then come back. And it becomes like this own experiment and this like its own like little mini life journey type of thing. But it's hard, right? I think it's like any other potential change you make in life where it's like, you say, I want this, whatever this is, I want to be a 9. But there's a certain unknown that you have to cross, and that unknown's difficult. And you're like, if I do this swing change, I'm going to hit this great shot, I think, but I also might hit into the houses. And that unknown of hitting the houses becomes so overwhelming that they never actually like make the change, right? So I think it's a little bit of that jump, that sort of like that sort of leap of faith of being like, I'm just going to do this.
You don't know what you don't know.
You don't know what you don't know, and you got to be okay with like the sort of the other side of it. Like I might hit some bad shots, but the more you can sort of let go of the pull of that and really immerse yourself in what you do want, that's when people tend to make those big changes. Yeah. And just like, again, an overall kind of like learning sort of, one of the things that I thought was interesting that Tiger did with his practice was, he would spend like, a lot of times people organize their practice of like, oh, I'm going to spend, 20 minutes chipping, 20 minutes putting, 30 minutes hitting balls, whatever. So like however much time they have, they break it up into like a very symmetrical chunk. One of the things that he would do is he would like, be like, I'm going to just chip all day today. And I'm going to putt all day today. So it became like, instead of this, and this was when he had weeks off, like going to a tournament, it became more even, because now it's like more of that, hey, let's just sort of maintain a certain skill level. But when he was in sort of like his own learning phase, whatever it was during the year, it was almost like he would do a deep dive in any one particular part, because then it gave him some space to like experiment and do some of that deep learning. So actually, that's something that I've kind of like brought to some of the people I work with, which I think has been helpful, where it's like, look, you got to become a better chipper. Part of it's like playing games and seeing if you can do that better. But part of it's like messing around with technique. There's certain shots you don't have, the contact, whatever it is. Go spend 3 hours chipping and let yourself get lost in it. And these are the things I want you to try out, to experiment with. And you might have these aha moments in your body where you're like, oh, that's freaking cool. And now all of a sudden that skill set is actually expanded.
Yeah. I think a lot of kids do that.
They do.
Into one thing and they figure it out. Yeah.
Totally. And I think
that's awesome. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that approach. Immerse yourself into it. I think you've hit on a lot of really cool things for my membership who want to get better or dying to get better, who play golf all the time. I think you hit the nail on the head, some things. So, Chris, that's awesome. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick. It's always fun chatting with you.
Thanks. We'll talk soon.
Okay. See you guys.